Okay, now you've done it. You have signed up for a college course in order to study humanities. That is, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, those branches of knowledge that concern themselves with human beings and their culture, or with analytic and critical methods of inquiry, derived from an appreciation of human values and of the unique ability of the human spirit to express itself. In particular, quote, the humanities include the study of all languages and literatures, the arts, history, and philosophy, end quote. They are fields of study that are, quote, distinguished in content and method from the physical and biological sciences and somewhat less decisively from the social sciences, end quote. All languages and literatures, the arts, history, and philosophy, seriously? All languages and literatures of the whole world and throughout human history? All the art in all of history? And philosophy, too? Human culture, all of it? That cannot be right. We could never do anything like that justice, even with more than one semester to study. It turns out that there is a much more specific topic within this idea. For the first part of this lecture, I want to talk about that specific idea. What do we mean by the humanities? We can trace the study of the humanities back to a time and place when studying human culture or human arts, artes, from the Latin translation of the Greek word techne, craft, method, technique, skill, seemed like a good new idea. You can already see from the origin of the word that these studies of humanity or human arts are referring to the situation in lands where Latin and Greek were studied. Where was this? Since antiquity and the conquests of Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BCE, over 1,000 years before the time we are going to talk about, BCE, by the way, is the same as BC, the Greek language and, mainly in Africa and Western Europe, the Latin language and literature had become commonly spoken and written across Europe, including Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, England, and most of Ukraine and Russia. Latin was the official language in much of Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. Greek was a major and sometimes an official language in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, as well as Egypt, Syria, Iran, and other parts of the Middle East, since the Eastern Roman Empire spoke and wrote literature in Greek that continued to be read in all these places. Byzantium, for instance, was a big center because it had been and continued to be the capital of the Roman Empire in the East. Interesting side note. This is why the Christian New Testament was written in Greek. Throughout the areas of the Middle East, Syria, Greece, and Turkey that were the main areas where the early Christians established their churches and communities in the 1st through the 3rd centuries CE, Koine, common Greek, was the most commonly spoken and written language. And again, CE is the equivalent of AD. CE stands for Common Era, BCE stands for Before the Common Era. So, the first systematic post-antiquity educational curriculum in Christian, Latin, and Greek speaking areas of Europe and Afro-Asia consisted of Christianized retellings of the pagan classics in Greek and Latin. What church officials and Christian political leaders saw as valuable in the pagan tradition was carefully Christianized and promoted by the Christian Church, the Catholic Church, as a kind of basic education for aristocrats especially, something that all free and dignified humans should learn. A good example of one scholar poet among many who did this transformational work is Boethius, 477 to 524 CE, a Roman senator, consul, magister officiorum, and philosopher of the early 6th century. Boethius went into public service as a senator under the Ostrogoth Emperor Theodoric the Great, but was imprisoned and executed in 524 at the young age of 47 by this same emperor on charges that Boethius was plotting to overthrow him. Nevertheless, before he died, Boethius translated many Greek classics, in particular parts of Aristotle's Ethics, into Latin. His versions of the classical pagan authors, from a Christian perspective, became the standard editions of these texts for an educated and literate Christian community, and his works on philosophy, mathematics, and music shaped the tastes of Europe for hundreds of years. Boethius took pagan ideas and reimagined them as they could apply to Christianity. For instance, while imprisoned, he wrote a famous treatise called On the Consolation of Philosophy, in which he imagined philosophy, a Greek pagan concept, as a beautiful woman, offering him advice in his sorrow that he not give up hope. Philosophy tells him that despite the apparent inequality of the world, there is, in Platonic fashion, referring to Plato's forms, that behind reality there is something invisible but more real than what we now see before us. There's a higher power, and everything else is secondary to that divine providence, a very Christian message derived from a Greek pagan idea. These transformed and salvaged pagan studies were labeled the good arts, bonae artes, and the free arts, artes liberales, the liberal arts, literally. That is, studies that all free men should participate in, mainly referring to aristocrats who were literate and did not need to slave or work for their living, but had time to learn. The definition of free included nobles, most priests, and some female clergy as well. The good arts were the basis of literacy and culture among those classes privileged to be able to share it. The Church founded a system of universities in Europe to promulgate these free arts. The universities were modeled on the universities and research institutions that had long been known throughout the Islamic world and which shared basic ideas also at the core of Jewish scholastic culture throughout the Mediterranean lands. For the pagan values inherent in the classics of Greece and Rome, were part of Islamic civilization from its start, partly specifically through Judaism, since the Hebrew Bible strongly influenced the Quran, and Jewish scholars had wholeheartedly adopted ancient pagan scholarly methods in the Hellenistic period. In fact, scholarship and scholarly conversation and debate about literature, both sacred and secular, was the lingua franca, a common inheritance of the literate minority in all Mediterranean lands. In Arabic, the term for a cultivated scholarly conversation is muhadathah, or mutual conversation and discourse, the basis for the humanities in Islamic civilizations. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cultures shared this very broadly defined classical past and approach to learning through books and conversation. All three thought of themselves as peoples of the book. In this way, the Church also was able to transform the pagan classics and to pass on a large amount of literature while remaining true to its propagation of Christian faith, just as Islamic religious and political leaders had also done with the pagan classics of philosophy and science since the 7th century CE, and as Jewish scholastics had done since about the 1st or 2nd century CE. But the tight grip of the Catholic Christian Church, which was the only church at that time, there were no Protestants yet, on that classical tradition, was being challenged in the 14th to 15th centuries. For one thing, the Black Plague had killed an estimated 1 to 2/3 of the population of Europe, sweeping through from 1347 to 1351, and then again in 1600 to 1660, killing over 2 million people. The shock and horror of this pandemic is hard to imagine. This is the Black Plague is another name for the bubonic plague. Repercussions on the economy included labor shortages, which in turn led to higher pay for surviving workers, and a savage influx of trade and a spike in mercantilism, as the Silk Road was temporarily at least replaced in part by European world ship travelers and traders, obviously. For another thing, in Germany, around 1440, the goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, which started the printing revolution. This began a new era of mass communication that changed European Christian culture in strange and unexpectedly powerful ways. Since books were easier to print, information and ideas could be disseminated in many more copies than before, much more easily. They had to be copied by hand before. Ideas and information could cross national borders. Threats to the power of political and religious authorities multiplied as people compared their situations with one another. There was a sharp increase in literacy. The elite free aristocrats and the clergy were no longer the only ones who had educations in the classics and beyond. A new middle class of traders and sellers of goods began to emerge and educate their children in the good arts, whether the elites liked it or not. Individual communities within parts of Europe that shared languages other than Latin, such as Italian, French, German, English, Portuguese, Spanish, began to become more self-aware of their own culture and their own vulgar languages, common languages as they called them, and protective of it. They began to think of themselves as individual nations. Communes grew up across Italy, Germany, Switzerland, France, and elsewhere. Communes were small and middle-sized towns that declared themselves independent of the Holy Roman Empire and decided to rule themselves by setting up a council of elders or an assembly of the people or a senate, council of decurions, rather than obeying a faraway king. In Italy in particular, many of these communes flourished and created a culture of independent city-states. Some of the first appeared in northern and central Italy, including Milan, Cremona, who's the home of Sofonisba, the artist that we will soon meet, who's pictured on the front of the class web page on Canvas. Mantua, Bologna, Padua, Verona, and others. Other city-states allied themselves with these commune cities, like Genoa, Turin, and Florence, Firenze, home of the Medici, Michelangelo, and other famous artists, Pisa, Siena, the earliest banking town, Assisi, and others. The maritime republics of Italy, most notably Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, had been powerful states independent of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries and had grown rich from their worldwide shipping trade. Genoa, as we just noted, allied itself with the communes, which strengthened its political and economic independence from the church. In these and many other ways, and for these and many other reasons, Christian people living around the Mediterranean lands during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries were becoming more skeptical of church leadership and more restless. As they did, their educated upper classes began to ask for a kind of education distinct from the traditional church liberal studies. The humanists were beginning to read and discuss books in their original pagan versions instead of in the Christianized way. They thought of themselves skipping over the church's intermediary positions and going back to the sources, the pagan sources, for a fresh, new reading. This fresh reading of the Greek and Roman classics and lesser known texts also often gave them new information, sometimes even suppressed information that the church had thought heretical or blasphemous. It focused them on human achievements rather than encouraging them simply to suffer through this life in hope of a reward in the afterlife or heaven. The humanists were excited by their new discoveries, inventions, and insights into human nature as they brought rediscovered, reinvented, and newly uncovered and newly edited texts, languages, perspectives, and ideas back into play. They were challenging the church culture that had ruled for centuries. Interesting side note. It is because of these humanist thinkers that we still use the label Middle Ages, medieval, for the period right before them, because these new 15th century humanists had decided that their age, and the age of the pagan Romans and Greeks had a special connection, and that the intervening years, the Middle Ages, so to speak, were less enlightened and duller. In fact, we owe to the Renaissance era the whole idea that the Middle Ages were dark and gloomy. They weren't, but they did have a different ideological outlook when it came to classics of Greek and Latin and the Church. We will learn more about some of these humanists. For now, let's concentrate on how rooted in the European landscape of the 15th century and later the idea of humanities really is, and that the fresh look back at the ancient classics, by leaping over the Christianized versions and coming face to face with pagan learning again, is what we generally mean by humanism, the attitude behind the humanities. So, in Humanities 202, we are not studying, quote, all languages and literatures, philosophies, and arts, end quote, exactly. We are looking at the particular types of art, literature, architecture, philosophy that were unfolding mainly in Europe and other areas around the Mediterranean, but not, for instance, in China, India, or the Americas, which had very different classical histories of their own. And we are looking at how art, literature, architecture, and philosophy developed in a humanistic or human-centered, as opposed to church or religion or God-centered way, starting from about 1400 CE to 1700 CE, is our first era that we're looking at, a time when the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire was facing many challenges to its political power and its domination of education across Christian Europe.